The 4th of September, 476. The city of Ravenna. A teenage emperor takes off his crown. His name is Romulus Augustulus. A barbarian general named Odoacer has come for his throne, and the boy simply gives it up. In the world we know, that quiet abdication is the moment historians mark as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the end of the ancient world. But what if it hadn't fallen? What if Rome had found a way to bend instead of break, and the empire of the Caesars had simply never ended? What would the last 1,500 years of human history have looked like?
To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand that the fall of Rome was never as simple or as sudden as the legend says. We picture it as a single catastrophe, barbarian hordes pouring over the walls, a great civilization extinguished in a day. The reality was slower, stranger, and far more contingent than that. First, a crucial fact. In 476, only the western half of the Roman Empire came to an end. The eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, the empire we now call Byzantine, did not fall. It survived for nearly another 1,000 years. So Rome, in a real sense, did not fall in 476 at all. Half of it sailed on for 10 more centuries. And the western half did not vanish cleanly either. When Odoacer deposed the last emperor, he did not destroy Roman society. He ruled Italy using Roman administrators, Roman law, Roman tax structures. The Senate of Rome kept meeting. Latin remained the language of government. For a long time, daily life, for many people, simply went on. So what actually happened in the 5th century was not an execution. It was a long, grinding unraveling. The Western Empire faced an overwhelming tangle of pressures, repeated civil wars between rival generals and emperors, a tax system straining under the cost of the army, waves of migrating and invading peoples, Goths, Vandals, and others, pushed, in part, by the terrifying advance of the Huns from the east. The loss of rich provinces like North Africa, which had been the breadbasket and a vital source of imperial revenue. Any one of these the empire might have survived. It had survived crises before, terrible ones. In the 3rd century, Rome had nearly come apart entirely, and then a series of reforming emperors had pulled it back from the edge and given it another 200 years. What broke the Western Empire in the 5th century was the pressures arriving all at once and a run of weak, short-lived, often child emperors who could not master them.
It was less a single mortal wound than a body too exhausted and too poorly led to recover from a fever it had survived many times before. So the question is not whether Rome could have survived. The eastern half did. The western half had survived worse. The question is what would have happened if the West, in its final crisis, had been led by the kind of emperor who had saved it once before.
In the real world, the Western Empire fell because its final crisis arrived in the hands of the weak. In our alternate timeline, it arrives in the hands of someone strong enough to meet it. We do not need a fantasy. We do not need magic. We need one thing that Rome had produced many times before: a capable, ruthless, reforming emperor arriving at the right moment. So in this timeline, in the middle of the 5th century, the Western throne passes not to a child and not to a figurehead, but to a soldier emperor in the old mold, a man like the great reformers of the 3rd century recovery. Call him, for tonight, the last reformer. His name does not matter. His choices do. What does such a man do? He does what Rome's reformers had always done. He makes peace with the most dangerous of the barbarian peoples by bringing them inside the system, settling them on Roman land, enrolling their warriors formally into the Roman army, giving their leaders Roman rank and Roman titles. This was not a fantasy. Rome had been doing exactly this in fits and starts for generations. The alternate emperor simply does it earlier, more deliberately, and on better terms. He reforms the tax system to keep the army paid. He stops the endless civil wars by being too strong and too competent to challenge. And critically, he stabilizes the succession. He ensures that power passes, when he dies, to another capable adult, and not to a boy in an oversized crown. We should be honest about what this empire becomes. It is not the Rome of the Caesars in its golden age. It is a transformed Rome, more militarized, more Christian, its army full of Gothic and Germanic soldiers, its culture slowly blending Roman and barbarian ways. But that is the entire point. An institution survives by changing. The Roman Empire of our own history had already transformed itself beyond recognition many times. From republic to empire, from pagan to Christian, from one capital to several. A surviving Western Empire simply keeps doing what Rome had always done. It bends. It absorbs. It adapts. And so, it does not break. That is the divergence. Not a miracle, not an unconquerable Rome, just one competent emperor arriving in time, and an empire that, this time, reforms itself through its crisis instead of dying in it. To understand what is saved, you have to understand what the fall of Rome actually cost. When the Western Empire came apart, in our timeline, it did not just change who was in charge. It dismantled a whole way of life. Consider the simple matter of scale. At its height, the Roman Empire bound together the entire Mediterranean world, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Near East, into a single state. One law, one currency, broadly, one network of roads, one vast free trade zone in which grain from Egypt fed the city of Rome and goods moved across thousands of miles in relative safety. When that unity broke, the network broke with it. Long-distance trade contracted sharply. The great cities shrank. The city of Rome itself, which may have held 1 million people at its peak, fell over the following centuries to a town of a few tens of thousands, its great monuments looming over fields and pasture. The practical skills of a complex society thinned. In parts of the former Western Empire, the quality of pottery declined. Coinage grew scarce. The knowledge of how to build in concrete and stone on the Roman scale faded in places for centuries. Literacy contracted toward the church and a narrow elite. Historians today, rightly, resist calling this a simple descent into darkness. The post-Roman world was inventive and dynamic and far from empty. But strip away the slander of the phrase Dark Ages, and a real contraction remains. A genuine loss of scale, of connection, of certain kinds of knowledge and capacity. So picture the alternate timeline. The Western Empire survives. And because it survives, the great unity does not shatter.
The Mediterranean remains a single Roman lake. The roads are maintained. The trade routes stay open. The cities do not collapse into villages. The city of Rome, in this timeline, does not fall to a town among ruins. It remains what it had been for centuries. One of the great living capitals of the world. The contraction simply does not happen. The student of the year 700 in this timeline does not look back at a vanished golden age. He lives inside one that never ended. A continuous Roman world stretching in an unbroken line from the age of the Caesars to his own. Here is one of the most profound consequences of a surviving Rome. It is not about armies or trade. It is about religion. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire was a Christian empire. Christianity had gone within a few centuries from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman state. And in our timeline, the fall of the Western Empire shaped the Christian church in a very specific way. When the Western imperial government collapsed, the church in the West was left as the last great institution standing. It inherited much of the administrative role of the vanished state. And crucially, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, rose over the following centuries into something no longer purely religious. He became a political power in his own right, a ruler of lands, a maker of kings, an independent force standing apart from and often against the secular rulers of Europe. That independence had enormous consequences. The long medieval struggle between popes and emperors, between church and crown, a struggle that runs through the whole of European history, grew directly out of the fact that in the West, the church and the state were separate powers, each able to check the other. Now think hard about the Eastern Empire, the Rome that did survive. In the Byzantine East, the emperor never lost his supremacy over the church. The Eastern emperor called the great councils. The Eastern emperor shaped religious doctrine. The church in the East remained broadly within the embrace of the imperial state. So here is the divergence for the alternate timeline. If the Western Empire survives, then the Western Church does not inherit the role of the vanished state because the state has not vanished. The Pope, in this timeline, never rises into an independent political sovereign. The Church of a surviving Roman West looks far more like the Church of the Byzantine East. A church embedded within the empire, its leaders appointed and overseen by the emperor, its doctrine shaped in imperial councils. And that single change reaches across 1,000 years. No independent papacy means no medieval struggle between pope and emperor. It may mean no crusades in the form we know them. Those were called, famously, by popes. And it may profoundly change the later religious history of Europe. The Protestant Reformation in our timeline was in part a revolt against the power, the wealth, and the corruption of an independent, politically dominant papacy. In a timeline where that papacy never existed, where the church was always a department of the Roman state. The great religious rupture of the 16th century may take an entirely different shape, or never come at all. So let us follow that thread forward. What does it do to the human world when the great Roman unity never breaks? Start with something we use every single day. Language. In our timeline, the fall of the Western Empire fractured the Latin world. Latin had been the common tongue of the entire Western Mediterranean. But once the unifying state was gone, once the regions were cut off from one another, the spoken Latin of each region began to drift. Province by province, generation by generation, the local Latin changed, until, after centuries of separation, it had become not one language, but many. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, the languages we call Romance, all of them the children of a Latin that shattered when its empire shattered. Now picture the alternate timeline. The empire does not break. The regions are not cut off. The roads stay open, the administration stays unified, the schools and the courts and the legions keep using a common, standardized Latin. In that timeline, Latin does not shatter into a dozen daughter languages. It remains what it was, a single living language, spoken from Spain to the Balkans, evolving slowly, yes, as all languages do, but evolving together, as one. Think about what that means. In this timeline, hundreds of millions of people across the Mediterranean world and beyond share a single native tongue. There is no language barrier between a citizen of Spain and a citizen of Italy and a citizen of North Africa, because they are not citizens of different nations speaking different languages. They are all Romans, speaking Latin. And the same logic applies to law and to identity itself. In our timeline, the fall of Rome eventually gave rise to the patchwork of separate kingdoms and then nations that we know, each with its own language, its own crown, its own fierce sense of being a distinct people.
The very idea of France, of Spain, of England, of Germany, as separate nations grew over many centuries in the space that the empire left empty. In the alternate timeline, that space is never empty. The people of the Western Mediterranean do not become French and Spanish and Italian. They remain, across all those centuries, simply Roman citizens, as their ancestors were, of a single, continuous, universal empire. It is hard to overstate how strange that world would feel. No France, no Spain, no Italy, no England perhaps as a separate kingdom. Instead, one vast Roman state, one citizenship, one law, one language, stretching, unbroken, across the heart of the world. Some of the deepest questions about a surviving Rome are about knowledge, about science and technology, and the long climb of human understanding. And here we have to be very careful, because there is a seductive story waiting to trap us. The seductive story goes like this. Rome was advanced. Rome had aqueducts, concrete, roads, engineering, sophisticated cities. If only Rome had survived, the story says, the empire would have had the steam engine by the year 600, the factory by 900, and we would have reached the moon 1,000 years early. We should slow down. That story is thrilling, and it is mostly wrong. Rome was a brilliant civilization, but its genius was practical, not theoretical. The Romans were superb engineers and administrators. They were not, for the most part,
driving the kind of systematic, experimental natural science that produced the scientific revolution. And Roman society had a deep structural feature that worked against industrial change. It rested heavily on slavery. When human labor is abundant and cheap, there is far less pressure to invent machines that replace it. A surviving slave-holding Rome may have had one of the weakest incentives imaginable to industrialize. So no, the alternate Rome does not land on the moon in the year 600. But, and this is the real and interesting point, a surviving Rome still changes the trajectory of knowledge. Not by leaping ahead, but by not falling behind. Remember what we have said on this channel before. Knowledge advances as a relay. One generation hands its understanding to the next. The most expensive thing that can happen is for the relay to be dropped. In our timeline, the fall of the Western Empire dropped the relay hard. An enormous body of ancient knowledge was lost in the West and survived only because it was preserved elsewhere, in the Byzantine East, and above all, in the medieval Islamic world, whose scholars translated, corrected, and extended the science of the Greeks before it flowed back into Europe centuries later. In the alternate timeline, the Western relay is never dropped. The libraries of the Roman West are not scattered. The schools do not close. The chain of literate, educated people is never broken. The knowledge of the ancient world, Greek and Roman alike, is simply never lost in the first place. So the science of this timeline does not need a renaissance, because a renaissance is a rebirth, and nothing in this timeline ever died. Progress is slow, held back by slavery and by Rome's practical bent, but it is steady. It never has to stop and climb back up and recover ground it had already won. It simply moves, gradually, continuously, from the world of the Caesars onward. Now we have to widen the lens, because a Roman Empire that survives into the modern age does not stay inside its old borders. Sooner or later, it looks outward, at the rest of the world. In our timeline, the great age of European exploration was driven by a particular set of competing kingdoms. Portugal and Spain led the way, small, aggressive states on the Atlantic edge of Europe, hungry for a sea route to the wealth of Asia, competing fiercely with one another. That competition mattered. The fragmentation of Europe into many rival states was, many historians argue, one of the engines of European expansion. When one kingdom refused to fund an explorer, he could simply walk to the next court and ask again. Columbus himself did exactly that. So a surviving, unified Roman Empire presents a real puzzle. A single vast state has no internal rivals to spur it on. It may be more cautious, more inward-looking, slower to gamble on dangerous voyages into the unknown. But it has other advantages, enormous ones. A continuous Roman Empire has resources beyond anything a small Atlantic kingdom could dream of. It has a unified treasury. It has the accumulated geographic and astronomical knowledge of the ancient world, never lost. It has a tradition, a deep institutional tradition of conquering, settling, administering, and Romanizing vast new territories. Rome had been doing that for 1,000 years. So when this alternate Rome does turn outward,
perhaps later than our timeline's explorers, perhaps in a different century, it does not turn outward as a small kingdom sending 3 little ships. It turns outward as a superpower. Imagine the consequences of Roman contact with the Americas. We have spoken on this channel about the catastrophe of that contact, the great dying, the diseases that killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population. A Roman arrival does not prevent that. Roman ships carry the same old world diseases as any other. But everything else would be different. The Americas in this timeline are not colonized by a patchwork of competing European crowns. They are encountered and very possibly absorbed by a single, unified, enormously powerful Roman state, applying the same machinery of provincial administration, Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman citizenship that it had applied to Gaul and Britain and Spain 1,000 years before. A Roman Mexico, a Roman Peru, provinces of a Mediterranean empire governed in Latin, organized on the model of the ancient world. Their conquest, no less brutal than the one our history knew, but their future folded into a single, universal state, rather than carved among many. There is one consequence of this timeline that is larger than any single province or any single war. It is about the shape of the whole human story. Our history has a particular structure, a structure so familiar that we rarely notice we are assuming it. We divide our past into ages, the ancient world, Greece and Rome, then a long medieval period, the so-called Middle Ages in between, then the Renaissance, the rebirth, which reaches back across that medieval gap to reconnect with the ancient world, then the modern age. That entire structure depends on the fall of Rome. The Middle Ages are defined as the period between the ancient world and its rebirth. The Renaissance is defined as the rediscovery of something that had been lost. The very words we use to organize 1,500 years of history are built on the assumption of a great break, a fall, a darkness, and a recovery. In the alternate timeline, there is no break, and so there are no Middle Ages. Think about that carefully. In this timeline, there is no medieval period, because a medieval period is, by definition, the gap between the ancient and the modern, and in this timeline, there is no gap. There is just Rome, continuous Rome, flowing without interruption from antiquity into the modern world. There is no Renaissance, because nothing was ever lost to be reborn. There is no rediscovery of ancient learning, because ancient learning was never out of reach. The people of this timeline do not look back at the Romans as glorious ancestors across a chasm of centuries. They are the Romans. The chasm does not exist. And we should be honest about what that costs. In our timeline, the very brokenness of European history was, in a strange way, generative. The fall of Rome cleared space. It allowed new things to grow in the ruins. New kingdoms, new languages, new institutions, new ideas that could never have grown in the shadow of a living empire. The competition of fragmented Europe, the dynamism of its many rival states,
the restless creativity of a continent that had to rebuild itself from pieces. All of that was a child of the fall. So the alternate timeline gives us a profound trade. It gives us continuity. No lost knowledge, no dark age, no shattered languages, no broken relay. But it may take away dynamism. A single, ancient, universal empire may be stable and learned and unbroken, and also slower, more conservative, less inventive, less hungry for the new than the restless, fragmented, competitive world that the real fall of Rome left behind.
Let us follow the alternate timeline all the way down.
Past antiquity, past the centuries, when our world had its Middle Ages, into the deep modern consequences. Start with the most uncomfortable one. A surviving Rome is not a kinder Rome. It is tempting to imagine that an unbroken Roman peace would be a gift, a long, stable, civilized order. But we must remember what the Roman order actually was. Rome was built on conquest. Rome was built on slavery, on a massive scale for its entire history. Rome ruled through spectacular violence, crushed revolts without mercy, and treated vast numbers of human beings as property. A Roman Empire that survives into the modern age is not a gentle thing. It is potentially a slaveholding, conquest-based empire that has had 1,500 extra years to perfect the machinery of domination. And that raises a hard question about freedom. In our timeline, the fall of Rome, for all its costs, eventually opened the way to new political ideas. The competition of many states, the slow emergence over centuries of parliaments, of constitutional limits on power, of the idea that a ruler might be bound by law and by the consent of the governed. These ideas grew, in part, in the spaces between the fragments, in the bargaining between weak kings and powerful nobles, cities and churches. A single, unbroken, universal empire may never develop those ideas at all. An emperor with no rivals, no competing states, no independent church to check him, ruling a citizenry with no memory of any other system, that is a recipe for autocracy without end. The alternate timeline may be a world that never invents the very idea of limiting the power of the state. Now turn to something quieter. Think about all the nations that in our timeline grew out of the fall of Rome, and all the cultures and languages and distinct peoples that came with them. France and the French, Spain and the Spanish, England and the English, Germany, Italy, and all the rest. In the alternate timeline, none of them exist. An immeasurable amount of human cultural variety, the distinct national literatures, the separate languages, the proud and particular identities that fill our world, simply never comes into being. In its place is one thing: Roman culture, Roman language, Roman identity. Vast and unified and ancient, but singular, where our world is plural. And that is the deepest trade of all.
The alternate timeline offers unity, continuity, and the unbroken inheritance of the ancient world. Our timeline offers fragmentation and loss and a broken relay, but also variety and competition and the slow, painful birth of new freedoms and new nations in the rubble of the old. Some changes ripple farther than borders and languages. They reach into how a whole civilization understands time itself. In our timeline, the fall of Rome gave the Western imagination one of its most powerful and enduring ideas: the idea that a great civilization can fall. For 1,500 years, the ruins of Rome have stood as a warning and a lesson. Poets and philosophers have walked among the broken columns and the shattered monuments and drawn the same hard conclusion: that nothing, however mighty, lasts forever. That empires are mortal. That a confident, powerful, seemingly eternal order can decline and weaken and one day simply end. That idea has haunted every great power since. Every empire, at its height, has glanced uneasily at the ruins of Rome and wondered if it too would one day be ruins. In the alternate timeline, that lesson is never taught. An alternate civilization in which Rome never fell has no ruined empire at the center of its memory. It has no great warning. It may carry, instead, a deep and untested assumption that its order is permanent, that Rome, having lasted from the ancient world to the modern, will simply go on lasting forever. And there is one more thread, the hardest one of all to weigh. We tend to assume that the survival of Rome would be, on balance, a good thing, that continuity is better than collapse, that an unbroken inheritance is better than a lost one. But this episode has tried to be honest. The alternate timeline keeps the knowledge and the unity and the peace of a continuous Rome. But it may lose the dynamism, the variety, the competition, and the slow, hard-won growth of freedom that our broken history eventually produced. It is a more stable world. It may also be a more rigid one, a world of one law, one tongue, one master, and no exit.
And our world, the world of the fallen empire, paid a terrible price for its path. The lost knowledge, the centuries of contraction, the broken relay. But out of that loss, and that fragmentation, and that long, difficult rebuilding, came the nations, the languages, the rival ideas, and the freedoms that we know. Both of those worlds are real possibilities. Both of them are honest readings of how history works. And both of them turn, in the end, on whether one empire, in one desperate century, found one emperor strong enough to make it bend, or whether it simply broke, as it did, in the hands of a frightened boy who took off his crown.